Yeah.
Why don't you tell us, Billy, about your experience of overwhelm or burnout? I don't know how you would describe it. Tell us a bit about that for you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question because I'm happy to use the word burnout because I didn't even realize that I was burnt out when I was burnt out. And that's precisely the problem, I think, in my head, where I was working at that school for quite a long time, around 6 years at that particular point, and just something had subtly shifted where the amount of work I was expected to do outside of work, just to be able to keep up with the marking expectations, as well as extra meetings, as well as even just like the commute and the travel anyway. And what had happened is slowly over time, I'd become bit more like a shell who I was, a bit more like a dampened version. And I didn't even realize that. It took my girlfriend to say, like, you're speaking in a much more monotone way than you normally do. That sounds really judgmental, like in a nice way, just saying like your energy is shifted. And noticing as well the fact that I used to have a lot of energy to go to the gym and to go running, and that I don't have that spark to want to do that anymore. And just my entire like bodily demeanor completely shifting to be essentially saying like what's the point in all this? I'm just living to work and that's all. And that was really difficult because I was so engrossed in it and so focused on the work that needed to be done, I didn't even realize like who I was. And that's going to have a massive impact if I'm feeling like that at home and then turning up into the classroom. Like the students are going to see that version of me, or a version of me which is already exhausted, and then trying to put on a show which is making me even more tired in the long run. And then it becomes this really vicious spiral of, well, that's where overwhelm turns into burnout. It's when you don't even realize that you're caught in that spiral up until it gets a bit too much. And yeah, that was how I realized after quite a long time. And it was quite a vulnerable moment for me as well, realizing that maybe I'm not this immortal, impenetrable, perfect teacher stood in front of the classroom. I've actually got like really limited resources, and they're being stretched to the limit here. They're being really pushed. And maybe what's being asked of me is more than I've actually got available. And that takes like a raw level of honesty to be able to
Wow.
accept that in yourself.
Oh my goodness. I your vulnerability is really having an impact on me. And I can imagine for teachers listening to this who feel a little bit like that, they're just thinking, yeah, that's me. And can you pinpoint any of the reasons you think you got to that point? What is it about the job, or for you, what was it that pushed you into that place?
There's definitely a question around boundaries, I think, with this, where early on in my teaching career, there was, as with a lot of people, especially because I'd always dreamed of being a teacher. So there was an enormous amount of excitement, and I loved being in the classroom. Then I loved going home to be able to plan the lessons because I was thinking, I can't wait to actually teach this and deliver that. And for the first 1 or 2 years, you can survive off that level of enthusiasm, and that's great. But then you realize a few years in, actually, I've got to make this sustainable in the long term. So then all of a sudden, that you've got to be able to sort of shift around like the boundaries and to be able to like actually honor them in yourself as well. And that can lead to making some quite difficult decisions. And something for me was I was naturally drifting towards decisions that were comfortable in the short term, but that weren't good for me in the long term. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later on in terms of like what that practically looked like. But really sort of the difficulty with me regarding burnout was that my life had essentially revolved around my role and my identity as just a teacher, and that is all. So suddenly, rather than just being in the classroom where I was a teacher, I was suddenly going home and thinking, okay, I'm a teacher. What are some things I can do and can't do? And that affected a lot of areas where even just going to the gym, I'd be thinking, I might see a student. A student cannot see me in anything less than like looking good in formal wear. So I can't go to the like gym walking there in a tracksuit or just in like jogging bottoms or anything else like that. So then even just the idea of going to the gym, which should be a healthy like and motivated thing, suddenly I was thinking, right, well, I don't want to go just in case I see somebody because this would affect my role as a teacher and how they might see me. And that affected then like what I was saying. It affected the music I was listening to. It affected things that it shouldn't have affected. And that's only obvious now looking back that actually I was yeah, I was dampening down my personality to fit a role generically rather than bringing myself into the role, which is what made it dynamic in the first place. You didn't
Yeah.
just have a teacher, you had me specifically as the teacher. And what makes the next lesson is amazing is that you've got someone else who is energetically themselves, who is also a teacher. And that's where I think a lot of teaching nowadays is struggling, where there's no emphasis on who the person is at the front of the room. All the emphasis is just on the technique and what you should and shouldn't be doing to be able to hit certain grade boundaries and certain outstanding or good
Mm.
performance indicators, rather than it being who is the person stood at the front of the classroom, because that's inseparable from the
Yeah.
teaching profession.
Wow. Because so many of us as teachers, we go in because we're passionate about it and it sort of feels like a vocation, doesn't it? But
Yeah,
actually, what you're saying is that because of the nature of the role now, especially, it sort of takes over you, and that passion and that excitement and that creativity actually is squashed out, and
yeah,
it's almost like you become a bit more robotic, and it's not you, and you're not then being the best teacher you could possibly be.
yeah.
Oh my goodness, that's so. Can I ask, one of the things that a lot of teachers say to me is that they feel they can't say no,
Mhm.
and so that leads a lot to the overwhelm. Did you have that?
I did. And again, I think this comes back around to the idea of boundaries. There was a lot of times where, and again, I don't want this to come across in any way as blaming any particular school, any particular head of department, any line manager, any senior leadership. It's nothing like that, because the pressure is just constant for everybody in a school. So I'm fully aware that pressure comes from essentially above and then gets pushed down. But the people at the top of the school, like the head teachers, equally have an enormous amount of pressure anyway. So, like I say, I just want to qualify this, that I'm not throwing anybody under the bus.
Yeah.
But with a lot of this, there's this subtle implied conversation of, I'm going to ask you to do something, and the expectation is that you're going to say yes. Like, there seems to be in a lot of my cases where you couldn't genuinely say no,